Back in 5 minutes, and we'll have our next speaker, Jason Lillian.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you all for finding your seats again as we continue with our conversation this morning. I am really pleased to introduce our next speaker, Jason Lillian. Jason is the Bureau Chief of the Charities Bureau, which, as we know, is part of the New York State Attorney General's Office. And in that role, he oversees nonprofits and their activities in our state. I had the honor recently of serving on the Attorney General's Nonprofit Revitalization Committee, and working with Jason and our colleagues on some pretty exciting things as we do talk about the future of nonprofits in our state. And I'm sure what we do here will also be a model for other places around the country. The report, as you all know, was released this month. We've invited Jason to give us an update today on nonprofit issues in New York, and with that, please join me in welcoming Jason Lillian, Bureau Chief of our New York Charities Bureau.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you. And Claire, we were very fortunate to have you work with us on our task force. Jack Kraskoff and Ronald Brown, we've heard from earlier, were also members, and all of them did extraordinary work. I am going to update you today. My primary update is going to be on this task force. It was formerly called the Attorney General's Leadership Committee for Nonprofit Revitalization. The Attorney General, within the last couple of weeks, released the report to the public and announced a series of steps to strengthen the nonprofit sector. I'm going to walk you through those in a few minutes, but let me just say this. Maybe I'll start with a bit of optimism here. I think there was a lot of very genuine discussion, genuine concerns expressed in the last panel. I'm actually quite optimistic. I'm optimistic of the future of the nonprofit sector. I think they're, notwithstanding historic financial and strategic challenges facing the nonprofit sector today is still performing the extremely important work on behalf of New Yorkers, and performing it as well as it ever has. And so I think we all have to take a step back and recognize the success and the contributions the nonprofit sector continues to provide New Yorkers. And it was really that reason why the Attorney General Schneiderman, almost a year ago, announced he was forming the Leadership Committee. People don't recognize, most people don't, you may, recognize the incredible, the significant role that nonprofits play across the state. Not just, well, in terms of the economy, it's absolutely very significant. Nonprofit jobs represent 18% of the state's private sector workforce. It is the #1 sector outside of government in terms of jobs. Nonprofits generate over $200 billion a year in revenue in New York, by far the most of any state in the country. Nonprofits keep our communities around New York vibrant. They are the principal source of arts and culture. I went to school in Binghamton, and if anyone is familiar with Binghamton, it's had, over the last 20, 30, 40 years, has gone through a very difficult period. Manufacturing has left, jobs have left. The community, in many ways, has gone through a series of problems over a period of time. But the nonprofit sector has remained strong. The arts in Binghamton remain strong. Binghamton still has an opera company. Binghamton still has a Philharmonic. Even though it's lost 30, 40, 50% of its population, a significant amount of jobs, those nonprofits create a sense of continuity, a sense of society, of community, that without them, that area would be a lot different. And that's the arts. And if you start thinking about all of the incredibly important services that help people, right, help people's lives, from elder care to child care to the homeless. I mean, this sector plays an incredibly important role, and Attorney General Schneiderman recognized that when he was coming into office as the new Attorney General last year, and decided to do something a little bit different. Instead of, the regulator telling the nonprofit sector what it ought to be doing, what he did was form a committee of representatives of key leaders from the nonprofit sector to work with the regulator to revitalize the sector. And that committee, the leadership committee, focused on really two areas. One was ways of reducing burdens on nonprofits, and the second key area was strengthening governance and accountability. If the nonprofit sector is going to thrive into the future, I think the Attorney General, I think the leaders of the sector recognize that we've got to do something about, we've got to figure out some way of addressing these two issues. I mean, for far too long, nonprofits in New York City, nonprofits in New York State have been dealing with a regulatory environment, we're dealing with regulatory burdens that are not only costing money, wasting money, they're diverting attention away from what's important, which is mission and oversight. It's also wasting, quite frankly, taxpayer dollars. Because every time, you all have to deal with bureaucracy, unnecessary red tape, you've got a bureaucrat sitting either in Albany or some office in other place in New York State dealing with that bureaucracy as well. There's two sides of pushing a piece of paper. You got to give it and receive it. And, there's a lot of people in New York receiving that piece of paper who work for the state of New York, and we've got to figure out a way of streamlining and modernizing our regulatory environment. It's the regulator now who's saying New York's regulatory system is outdated, it's antiquated, and it's costing taxpayer as well as wasting taxpayer and charitable dollars. So the leadership committee focused on ways of reducing burdens on nonprofits and really fell into two buckets. One bucket primarily dealt with nonprofits that contract with the state of New York, that receive funding from the state of New York to perform services. And any of you who do that, or work for an organization that does that, meaning contract with the state, have probably experienced different levels of frustration. And I'm putting that mildly, right? It is, I don't have to tell you what you have experienced for years, in fact, decades, which is filing redundant and unnecessary paperwork over and over and over again. Waiting months and months and months for a contract for your services to be approved and then paid. Facing multiple audits on the same issues. These issues are decades old, and the leadership committee focused on very pragmatic but important changes to the system, to the funding system, to eliminate these burdens. And in our report, a copy of which is on our website, charitiesnys.com, there's a series of very practical, but again significant steps to fix the contracting problem in New York State. The committee recommended creation of a data vault so that once you file papers, you only have to file them once, and every state agency can then access those papers. New York City is moving in that direction right now. But the fact that you have to file the same set of bylaws year after year when they haven't changed, and then you got to file them across New York State government is absurd. And so the committee identified ways of including the data vault to eliminate that, streamlining and centralizing integrity reviews so that your organization is not subject to the same questioning over and over again when it really should be done once. I encourage you to look at the report that delineates the specific recommendations regarding contracting, but it also lays out a series of very specific recommendations to reduce other burdens on nonprofits. Nonprofits that are operating in New York and nonprofits trying to form in New York. We have the main law that governs nonprofit organizations in New York is called the Not-for-Profit Corporation Law. It was drafted in the late 60s and has not been meaningfully amended since. So we're dealing with a statute that is, decades old and hasn't received attention. It's time that we modernize the statute. It's time we modernize the statute to reflect technology so that we can include electronic notices, for example, or permit electronic notices of meetings. I mean, it doesn't really make sense today. And many of you may have realized this, that if you're trying to call a meeting, you're not allowed to send out an electronic notice of a meeting. You still have to, you've got somebody in office putting together binders and envelopes and delivering them, handing them out. It's time that we modernize the statute to make functioning board operations more efficient. We have a situation in New York right now where private foundations, and I recognize many of you are not private foundations, but those of you who are, private foundations year after year are required to publish in a newspaper the fact that their annual financial report is available to the public for inspection. Right? I don't know if any of you know that. There are ads right now throughout newspapers in New York that say that, notwithstanding the fact that financial report is filed with our office, it's publicly available on our website, on the internet, it's filed with the IRS, it's on GuideStar and probably half a dozen other sites. So that requirement is literally wasting hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, probably more, in terms of newspaper ads. To incorporate an organization in New York, it is probably the most Byzantine and archaic system in the country. For many of you who've gone through this process, many of you, there's not a place in hell for those who came up with this. You have to pick a type when you incorporate. Most of you don't even know what type you are, probably, and even after reading the statute, you still can't figure it out. What often happens is that certificate of incorporation that includes what type you've selected is rejected because you picked the wrong type. Type A, type B, type C, type D. Once you've submitted it, often, the certificates are rejected because you have not obtained the necessary consent from a government agency. Mostly it's the Department of Education, because there may be educational purposes set forth in your charter, and the Secretary of State's office says, oh wait, you need to get approval of the Department of State. All of these steps in the process, right, it takes up time, it's annoying, but it also wastes dollars. You often have to hire a lawyer. And even if you have to hire a lawyer, you've got to just, use one of your internal staff members to follow up on this. And it just gets very frustrating. It also delays, unfortunately, your ability to get tax exemption from the federal government. So, these are the kinds of burdens that are decades old, that need to be reduced. There are far more of them delineated in the report. The second area of focus, and it's one that has been, that has been the focus of the discussion today, focus of increasing attention in the media, in government, is strengthening the public's trust in the nonprofit sector. I think what was very important about this task force, the leadership committee, is that you had the nonprofit leaders sitting down with the Attorney General. The nonprofit leaders recognized the importance of maintaining the public trust, making sure the public has confidence that the billions of dollars that are entrusted each year to nonprofits and their boards are managed properly. But they also felt very strongly, as I do, that regulation needs to be responsible and balanced. It has to serve an appropriate objective, and it can't produce unnecessary burdens on nonprofits and their boards. What we need is smart, focused regulation that achieves its objectives of strengthening oversight. And what the nonprofit sector representatives who are on this committee identified were those specific areas, those specific reforms that would give the public more confidence that their money was being well spent without producing, again, unnecessary burdens. There's been a lot of talk about executive compensation, a lot of talk. Many of you are familiar with the executive order that came down on executive compensation. Regulations are now being drafted about that. What the committee did over a period of time was look at the cause of some of the issues, recognizing, as it did in its report, that most of the sector is being run responsibly, that executive compensation is not a widespread issue regarding across the sector, but there are issues, there are certainly outliers, and all nonprofits, whether they're nonprofits who may be doing something afoul, or nonprofits trying to do the right thing, would benefit from greater statutory guidance regarding executive compensation. The reality is New York law provides virtually no statutory guidance on executive compensation. Of course, fiduciary principles will guide director conduct and guide what directors are supposed to be doing, but the statute itself, in terms of express requirements, is virtually silent. So the committee identified significant changes to New York law to strengthen the board oversight over compensation. Many organizations are already doing this as a practical matter because of IRS requirements, but the committee recognized that it's important for the board of directors, to be engaged in the process of reviewing executive compensation to make sure that it's reasonable for the organization. Again, the focus was on what's important in terms of oversight, but without producing unnecessary burdens on nonprofits. It's a balanced approach, but a significant reform. So the committee identified recommendations such as requiring that the board of directors or a compensation committee of the board review compensation, determine that the CEO's compensation is in fact reasonable and fair and commensurate with the services being provided, requiring that that process be an independent one, so that those who have an interest in the compensation aren't also participating in the process. Some common sense steps that many organizations are already taking, but many organizations aren't. And it's important that, and what we were hearing from the committee and what I've been hearing around the state, is that boards would benefit from a stronger roadmap. What should we be doing is what boards often say. And what the statutory recommendations, the changes that the committee recommended, would provide that roadmap to ensure that boards are meaningfully engaged in reviewing executive compensation. A second set of recommendations dealt with review of outside audits. New York law requires most organizations that that have revenues over $250,000 to have a financial audit. But the law sets forth no specific requirements as to what a board should be doing with that audit. So you have a requirement that you get an audit, but it doesn't say what you're supposed to do with that audit. Again, providing a roadmap to boards, helping boards perform their fiduciary responsibilities by providing a roadmap as to what conversations they should be having when they receive the audit. What should they do with this audit? Remember, there's, again, common sense steps, not overly burdensome, but what good boards should be doing anyway. Strengthening our office. There's been a lot of talk about, and there's been a lot of media interest in some abuses of executive compensation, abuses of self-dealing. And I agree with many of you in this room that those are outliers. And we have to recognize, as the regulator, I have to recognize, our office should be recognizing, that the vast majority of charities are not in the outliers. They're not the ones who are abusing this system. But our office, as the regulator, must be in a position to enforce the law against those outliers when they occur. And so the committee, I think, rightfully identified specific steps, specific changes to New York law to strengthen the Attorney General's office's ability to go after those who are abusing the system. Because the more we're able to enforce the law against the ones who are truly outliers, the ones who are violating the law, the better, the more trust there is. I don't know if it's still up there, start with trust. The more trust there is in the sector. It protects legitimate charities. It protects the nonprofit sector when we're equipped to go after the outliers, after those who are abusing the law. There are other steps that are identified in the report in terms of statutory changes, but I want to just, before I close, I want to just talk about very quickly two programs that are as important as these statutory changes. While I believe, and I think the committee believes, that statutory steps are needed to modernize the law, to make it clear that boards have a responsibility, clearer that boards have a responsibility in terms of oversight over these key areas, at the end of the day, ultimately, good governance comes down to people. It comes down to the people who are serving on the boards. It comes down to the people. People who have the skills, the time, the interest, and the commitment to do their jobs effectively. I don't believe that government or regulation can mandate good governance. I don't believe that. I believe government can set a framework, set parameters for conduct, but ultimately it's up to boards to exercise their responsibilities to carry them out. We can enforce the law, but by the time it comes to our office as an enforcement, it's too late. We need boards who are on the ground on the front lines to be positioned to do their oversight, exercise their oversight responsibilities as effectively as possible. And so the leadership committee recommended two very important programs that are going to help strengthen board effectiveness. One is a program called New York On Board, which is a partnership between the nonprofit sector, our office, and the business community to create a new pipeline of directors. One of the things we hear frequently, particularly outside of Manhattan, but even in Manhattan, is that it's becoming increasingly challenging to recruit people to serve on boards. I mean, larger organizations, well-known organizations, probably won't have or don't have the same degree of difficulty. But smaller ones, you get outside of Manhattan, you go upstate, they're having a lot. The talent pool is not that deep. And one of the realities is that there are far more people, a far greater number of people who could be serving on boards across the vast degree of industries in New York, amount of industries in New York, than are currently serving. Think about the sectors we have in New York, the private sectors we have in New York, from advertising to insurance to finance to real estate, across the board. There needs to be a greater pipeline to get employees serving in these industries to serve on boards. And the idea behind New York On Board is to have companies who sign up for it incorporate outside board service into their philanthropic programs. So they're providing not just financial capital, which they do quite generously across New York, but also human capital. Get their people and their experience and their skills and their diversity onto boards to make boards stronger. The second program is called Directors U. It's a program that recognizes that new directors recruited through New York On Board, or existing directors, must have the comfort level, the awareness, and the knowledge base to serve effectively on nonprofit boards. And while many organizations, including the Better Business Bureau, other organizations across New York State, do a lot of work in terms of training and education, one of the things that became apparent to us, became apparent to the committee, was that the nonprofit sector in New York, boards in particular, would be well served by having a one-stop shop for director education in New York. A website in particular that would have an online library of seminars and webinars that's free to the nonprofit sector on the vast majority of topics. Think of like a Netflix of director education materials. Go on a website, you download your topic of choice, and it's organic. It keeps updating over a period of time. Those will be supplemented by in-person training sessions as well. Directors U has, I will tell you very quickly, not only has Baruch agreed to help, agreed to join a consortium to help develop Directors U, but so have leading colleges in New York and across the country, including Cornell, Columbia, NYU, Yale. It's going to be a terrific program. All of this, and I'm literally being forced off the stage as we speak. I want to just say to you, what we're trying to do here in the Attorney General's office is to work with the nonprofit sector to build the stronger nonprofit sector of tomorrow. I think what's important is that we attack the issues of today from different angles. We have to make the regulatory environment less burdensome so that you're able to do your jobs as effectively as possible. But also, it's very important that we work together on governance. We work together on strengthening accountability, because I do believe that unless we do so, it's going to be increasingly difficult going forward to get to where we need to be in terms of the sector, to talk about the positive things the sector needs to talk about, when there's so many, when there's so many issues still in the papers today about accountability. If the sector itself stands with and works with the Attorney General in improving governance and accountability, I think we all win. Thank you very much.